What is corruption, and what can Myanmar do to stop corruption? Over the next 10 minutes, we hope to answer these very important questions, as well as provide an analysis of the consequences of corruption. Corruption is defined by the World Bank as the misuse of public office for private gain. It is important to note that corruption is a broad term, covering a range of institutions, organizations, companies, and individuals that profit from their position and thereby cause a loss. This can include the giving and receiving of bribes, extortion, nepotism, embezzlement, fraud, and conflict of interest. The consequences of corruption can be measured in economic, welfare, and political terms. We will start by first looking at the economic consequences of corruption. Did you know that corruption costs the economy more than 2.6 trillion US dollars a year? In GDP terms, this works out to around 5% of global GDP. Of this, more than 1 trillion US dollars is through the payment of bribes. That's equal to 46,512 76-carat rubies from Shuidan Pagoda. Apart from the cost of the global economy in monetary terms, corruption also increases the existence of illegal businesses. These illegal black markets lead to a loss of tax revenue for governments as well. The Corruption Perceptions Index scores countries on a scale of 0, which means highly corrupt, to 100, which means very clean. Myanmar faces a major challenge of endemic corruption, consistently ranking at the bottom of the Corruption Perceptions Index. In low-income countries, it is estimated that a 1-unit fall in the Corruption Perception Index could result in an increase of 0.59 percentage points in the growth rate of per capita GDP. The consequences of corruption can also be measured in welfare terms. Corruption leads to inefficient delivery of public services and to weak implementation of social programs, hurting those who need them the most. Corrupt politicians appear to choose public investment projects not on the basis of their intrinsic economic worth, but on the opportunity for bribes and kickbacks these projects present. Such investment may impact the efficacy of public welfare because of the low productivity. Finally, we can measure the consequences of corruption in political terms. Corruption leads to a loss in trust in politicians. In Myanmar, there is no competitive process to enter the public sector. Bribery and nepotism can be important qualifications in entering the civil service. High-ranking civil servants come mainly from the military, not on the basis of expertise. This hurts the political participation and the trust of the people. Now that we've seen the consequences corruption can have, let's review some of the causes of corruption. In order to identify the causes of corruption, it is useful to understand the different forms of corruption. To start with, we can look at the institutional location. The institutional location differentiates political corruption from fraud taking place in society. Therefore, it assumes that corruption takes place at two levels, the upper or policy-making level and lower or administrative level. At the upper level, the main economic cause of corruption is centralized political power, which results in the ability to extract rent from individuals or organizations. The main political cause of corruption at the upper level is strong links between the ruling elite and organized criminal activities, and a lack of regulatory and legal transparency. At the lower level, the main economic cause of corruption is red tape and bureaucracy. Individuals and organizations need to obtain a license or permit from one department before they can proceed to another, which provides the power to extort. Also, lower wages in the public sector relative to market wages or an acceptable standard of living make bribes an attractive alternative source of income. The second form of corruption is in terms of the direction of influence. This illustrates the direction corruption is moving in, drawing the limits between bribery and extortion. The economic causes are because of scarce benefits. People bribe to get extra incentives ahead of others. Firms also bribe in order to obtain access or rights to valuable resources. The political causes are that the degree of law enforcement and judicial oversight is low. In fact, Myanmar's police force is able to extort citizens as they are a powerful organization that has been in control alongside the army. To escape the threat of punishment, citizens are willing to pay when extorted. The last form of corruption is in terms of size and frequency. This illustrates corruption from the context it occurs in terms of the size and frequency of transactions that take place, or the degree of market competitiveness. The economic causes are due to low competition in the market. For example, the Ministry of Telecommunications, Post and Telegraph produced their own handsets and set a price control that was below market prices for the cellular and GSM network. The prices were shielded from private market competition, and citizens were thus encouraged to bribe officials to get access to the government's below market prices. This encourages illegal black markets. The CIA Factbook reports that the illegal market is as large as the official economy in Myanmar. The political causes are the lack of political competitors. In Myanmar, power is currently consolidated with one party. There are high fees to register new political parties, and new political parties do not get access to state media. Funds are being siphoned off by corrupt officials as they have dominant power in controlling the flow of funding. Now that we've seen the consequences and causes of corruption, how do we solve the problem of corruption? There are two basic steps to implement solutions to corruption. The first is to identify where the corruption lies in the system, and the second is to identify the type of corruption to better address the causes. The problem of corruption will have to be tackled by the government, private sector, and NGOs as a concerted effort. In the short term, the government can provide disincentives to corrupt. This means stiffer punishment for those who corrupt, and making sure that there is stricter, more efficient enforcement. Myanmar can also take the example of the Hong Kong police, where they allowed amnesty. Those who own up and repay any proceeds from corruption are allowed to continue working. This will allow the government to continue functioning. Another step is to enact and strengthen prosecution laws for the Anti-Corruption Commission. This provides a commission with the power required to enforce regulations and carry out its mission. Also, it is important to give priority to corruption cases in courts. This sends a message that the judiciary is intent on curbing corruption quickly. For example, Indonesia's Corruption Eradication Commission, also known as the KPK, has the ability to fast-track corruption cases in their courts. Finally, increasing wages as well as tying benefits and bonuses to performance. Wages should be benchmarked to comparable wages in the private sector. Bonuses can be tied to job performance levels, such as the amount of taxes collected, which has been implemented in Singapore, to provide an incentive for officials to perform their duties properly. In the short term, the private sector and NGOs can focus on providing employees and stakeholders resources on corruption. This can be in the form of employee handbooks or pamphlets, case studies, or online resources. This will ensure that if employees have any doubts on whether a practice is corrupt or not, they have a resource to refer to. Also, firms can carry out due diligence on third parties. Firms should ensure that all third parties, such as suppliers and contractors, are not involved in corrupt practices and they are penalized if found to be involved. In the medium term, the government can reduce red tape and bureaucracy by introducing single window clearance for the issuance of license and permits. This reduces the chance of corrupt officials extorting or being bribed. A good example of this is Hong Kong's TradeLink, which provides a single platform for trade documentation. The government can also subject organizations to internal and external audits. Audits increase the possibility of corruption being discovered and dissuades individuals and organizations from engaging in corruption. Another step that can be taken is to set up whistleblowing processes within the government and for the public to encourage citizens to expose corrupt officials. The government should provide rewards for the correct identification of corrupt officials. Bangladesh has a good whistleblowing process that can be studied through the use of random surveys of households to establish sources and incidents of corruption. Finally, the government should increase transparency in government processes, particularly procurement and licensing. Transparent and competitive bidding systems for government projects will eliminate kickbacks. In the medium term, the private sector and NGOs can support whistleblowers by providing financial incentives through cash grants or rewards, as well as creating a legal defense fund for whistleblowers and providing a platform for anonymous reporting. Firms can also implement transparent procurement processes to ensure that no supplier has an undue advantage over another for the supply of goods or services. Finally, regular internal and external audits will ensure that any discrepancies are noticed immediately. In the long term, the government can make use of technology to implement electronic services. E-services reduces the contact between corrupt officials and customers, thus reducing the opportunity for corruption. Given that the internet infrastructure is in its infancy in Myanmar, this will be a long-term project. The government should also provide rights to demand information, such as budget and expenditure, so that external organizations and civil society can serve as a check and balance on government. Although India has allowed citizens to demand access to information through the Right to Information or RTI Act, the procedure is highly bureaucratic and Myanmar should serve to avoid such ineffectiveness. Finally, the government can provide education to the population that corruption is not acceptable. By educating the youth that corruption should not be a way of life, Myanmar will be able to build on its efforts in increasing the number of honest officials as well as whistleblowers. In the long term, the private sectors and NGOs can frame a code of ethics which will provide a policy towards the firm's stand against corruption. This can include ISO 26000, also known as a Social Responsibility Certification, as well as adopting the UNGC's Principle 10, Agreement Against Corruption in All Forms. Firms should also take advantage of technology to create social media campaigns via Twitter and Facebook, as well as set up websites for reporting corruption. An example is India's ipayidabribe.com, where the public can report bribes that were demanded from them. Finally, firms should act in compliance with international money laundering acts, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, and the international accounting standards such as International Financial Reporting Standard, IFRS.